Sunak says Britain is braced for a range of scenarios after the Wagner Group's mutiny in Russia. The private Russian military group were just 120 miles from Moscow when their leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, brokered a deal with Vladimir Putin and ordered his troops to immediately turn around. And in the last few minutes, the Wagner chief has spoken for the first time since Saturday. Joining me now is the defence editor at The Sun, Jerome Starkey, and Cormac Smith, the former advisor to Ukraine's foreign minister. Welcome to you both. Let's start with you, Jerome, so you can explain what happened, because this seemed to kind of come and go with such speed and such force. It left people kind of ricocheting with shock. Nobody really understood, but what we do know is that we're warned that Russia could be incredibly precarious, to be poised for something, but we're not sure what. So I'm hoping that you will fill us in on who these people are, what the significance of what happened is, maybe how it was averted at the last minute, and what could happen next.
Hi, Vanessa. Well, this all started on Friday night when Wagner Group mercenaries, now they're a private army which has largely been sponsored and loyal to Moscow, that's been very heavily involved in the fighting in Ukraine. On Friday night, these fighters made a surprise move into Russia from Ukraine, and they went to two cities, Rostov-on-Don, which is home to the headquarters of Russia's Southern Command, where Russian forces have been commanding much of the war in Ukraine, and they also moved on a city called Voronezh, about 300 miles to the north. Now, in Rostov, we know that they captured military bases. They appeared to take control of the city without meeting any significant resistance, and it was a similar story in Voronezh to the north. On Saturday morning, after they'd taken these two towns, they then began racing northwards towards the capital, Moscow. Now, it was some 300 miles distant, but this essentially gripped Russia, forced President Putin to make an emergency address, because for the first time, he was facing an armed uprising, a mutiny among the military ranks, and it felt like these Wagner soldiers were heading for a very violent armed confrontation for control of the Kremlin. Indeed, some of Prigozhin's supporters had predicted that there would be a new president. Putin had come out on television and he told Prigozhin to stand down. He accused him of treachery, treason, mutiny. He said it was a stab in the back. Prigozhin responded saying, "No, you're mistaken, Mr. President," but he insisted this was about fighting back against what he saw as the injustices inflicted on his Wagner group by Russia's Ministry of Defence and the generals, who Prigozhin has repeatedly and outspokenly criticised as incompetent and corrupt. Now, just when it was reaching the sort of crunch moment, the climax came late on Saturday afternoon, evening time in Russia, when suddenly there was an announcement that the march to Moscow had been called off. The crisis, or at least part of the crisis, had been avoided. We're led to believe that Belarusian President Viktor Lukashenko had been called in as an intermediary. Now, if what we're told is correct, he had persuaded Prigozhin to stand his men down. And from that point on, it appeared to be a de-escalation. He said that the terms of the deal were that Prigozhin would not be prosecuted, his men would not be prosecuted, he would be allowed to travel to Belarus and live in exile, and the Wagner Group would be disbanded. Now, we understand this whole fight, this whole incident, this uprising was about Prigozhin's fears that his Wagner Group was going to be disbanded, and that was because Putin had signed a decree ordering all private military companies to sign a contract that would have brought them under the command of the Ministry of Defence. And that would have clearly neutered Prigozhin's power, because he draws his power from having command of this private army. Wagner has operated for many years all around the world. It's seized diamond mines in the Central African Republic. It's involved in Mali, helping the government there. But its most notorious involvement, its fiercest fighting by some distance, has been in and for the town of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. And that's the battle that for many, many months has been the epicenter of the war in Ukraine. When Russian soldiers failed to achieve the victory they thought they would get quickly, Prigozhin sent his Wagner mercenaries in, and eventually, when that town was finally captured in May, he claimed it as a great victory. Now, interestingly, what he said today in his most recent address is that his march on Moscow on Saturday, the speed with which his soldiers advanced, the ease with which they passed Russian military checkpoints, he was saying if they'd been allowed to control, to command the main offensive, the main Russian offensive in Ukraine, then perhaps they would have taken Kyiv. There is clearly no shortage of this man's ambition, ego, or self-belief.
Thank you very much indeed, Jerome. Let me bring Cormac in, and then I might bring Jerome back in to see what he thinks about what Cormac has to say. Cormac, obviously you're there, you're poised, you absolutely intimately understand the delicate politics and the frailties and vulnerabilities of each of the areas around you and why. So, A, were you surprised by what happened? And B, were you surprised by the rapidity of the de-escalation? Because one minute it looked as if it was all up for Putin. The next minute, he was back on an even keel. Although we are being told to watch out for what, we don't know what.
Vanessa, good afternoon, and Jerome, good afternoon as well. Vanessa, I was surprised to an extent, but I must say also I have been wary from the very beginning of any elaborate form of Russian deception at play. And I would reflect on what the Prime Minister said earlier today, that it is simply too early to draw any conclusion as to what is going on. We simply don't know what it was that that persuaded Prigozhin to stand down, and we don't even know under what terms he has now gone to Belarus, whether he is effectively under house arrest and at the mercy of Lukashenko, who of course we know is in Putin's pocket, or if there is something else. Interestingly, over the weekend and up to late last night, I was speaking to various friends in Kyiv, including a number of very senior diplomats, and their attitude, well, I would summarize their attitude by, there was a joke that the shops in Kyiv had run out of popcorn, that people were, schadenfreude is probably the word, people were sitting back and enjoying what is clearly a signal that Russia is fast becoming a more of a failed state. However, from the official Ukrainian side, I sense considerable caution. It was impressed on me that the plans for the counteroffensive will not change in the slightest. I can tell you that I believe the main counteroffensive has not yet begun. What has been happening in recent weeks has been what the Ukrainians refer to as shaping operations. And, you know, if anybody is expecting a very, very quick win out of this counteroffensive, they're in for a shock. It's going to be a fairly long battle.
But Cormac, sorry to interrupt, but who will be mounting this counteroffensive? Are you still talking about the Wagner Group, or are you thinking?
No, sorry, I'm talking. No, Vanessa, I'm very sorry. I'm talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
Oh, the Ukrainian
that we've been hearing. We've been hearing about for some time, and there has been a lot of questions as to whether this attempted coup would impact positively or negatively on that counteroffensive. And I was making the point that the Ukrainians that I have spoken to, while they see this as destabilizing Russia, it has probably had no impact on the front line as yet. And what I've been told is that regardless of what has happened over the weekend, that plans for the Ukrainian counteroffensive will not have changed.
Let's get Jerome to comment on that. Jerome, obviously, Cormac's right in the centre of what's going on. What do you make of what he said? Do you share his view?
Well, I think Cormac, I think the caution is clearly very, very sensible. I mean, we have to remember that everything we know, or not everything, but a lot of what we know from Russia comes through sort of very filtered sources from a government and from institutions that are conditioned to lying. It's interesting today that we've seen a video released of Russia's Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu apparently making a visit to the Western Military Command. One of the things that has been spotted is that one of the watches of the generals he's meeting has been blurred over in the video, perhaps to try and obscure the date from when that film was made. Now, the fact that that film has been released would appear to be a signal from the Ministry of Defence, indeed from the Kremlin, that Shoigu, Defence Minister Sergei Shoigu, still enjoys the confidence of President Putin. Now, that's important because much of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the Wagner commander's anger was directed at that one man, at Sergei Shoigu, and indeed at his chief of defense staff, General Gerasimov. And there had been some speculation that as part of the compromise, as part of the deal cut with Prigozhin, we might see changes at the top of Russia's armed forces. And clearly that uncertainty, that second guessing, is an opportunity for Ukraine, because the soldiers, the Russian soldiers who are fighting on the ground, who are risking their lives in horrific conditions, being asked to fight this atrocious war, will be now guessing, will be wondering who is in charge. Is Vladimir Putin in charge? He couldn't really prevent armed mutineers from racing to within 100 miles of Moscow. Is Sergei Shoigu in charge? He hasn't been seen or heard of properly since. Is General Gerasimov, does he still have the confidence of the Kremlin? All of that would serve, I imagine, to undermine the morale of Russian soldiers who are aware of it on the front line. And equally, as Cormac said, in Ukraine, this has had the opposite effect. It's been a morale boost, because they've managed to sit back, the popcorn meme, which we've seen a lot of, soldiers enjoying the spectacle, relishing the moment to watch Russia in turmoil.
And let me just go back to Cormac. Cormac, for the immediate future, obviously you're not a fortune teller, we get that completely, but in the next few weeks, what are you expecting might break out in the area?
I think we're going to see steady progress on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I'm not, as you know, a military man, but I listen very, very carefully to the military men. And while there was some considerable concern earlier in the summer that that we could supply the Ukrainians with the amount of ammunition they were using, the signals that I'm hearing more recently is that they are indeed getting the ammunition they need. More importantly, the three main weapon systems they've been crying out for almost from the beginning of this. The battle tanks, they have now got, thanks in large part to the Brits and the Challenger tanks, which we provided in February. Also, the longer range artillery, they're now getting again, thanks to the Brits, giving the Storm Shadow missiles, which brings their range up from 80 kilometers to 250 kilometers. And the third one was the modern battle jets. And we saw a few weeks ago that that President Biden finally relented on allowing Ukraine be supplied with F-16s. Now, it's going to take some time for those to get in place. But the point that I wanted to make, if anybody thinks that this counteroffensive is going to be a miraculous quick win, it's not. I spoke to a very senior Ukrainian diplomat last night who impressed upon me that probably the main counteroffensive has not yet begun. As I said earlier, what has been happening for the last 2 or 3 weeks has been shaping operations. And again, the one thing that the military men and the ones that I follow and respect the most tell us is, for a counteroffensive of this nature to be really successful, the Ukrainians will have to gain air superiority. So it is going to take some time to get the additional anti-aircraft cover and the modern fighter jets into place. But the clear signal that I got from the Ukrainians was two things. One, as Jerome had said, the popcorn meme, that Ukrainians in general were sitting back and enjoying, Russia's difficulty is Ukraine's opportunity. And this, I would say, is a clear sign that Russia is a failed state. And that has got to seep down to the front lines and to the effectiveness of the Russian command. And, the one other thing I'd say, I said in an earlier interview, I don't think it's necessarily the oligarchs and the generals and the senior people who are going to determine this. It's the troops in the front line. And remember, the troops from the regular Russian army have been fighting shoulder to shoulder with the troops from Prigozhin's Wagner army. So the big question for me is, when news of this starts to filter through to the front line, and many of the troops in trenches on the front line won't yet know about this, but when news of this filters through, what effect is that going to have on morale? What effect is that going to have on their trust of their commanders? And will troops start to change sides? I don't think we have heard the final act of this so-called coup yet. There is still far too much that we don't understand. And remember, as I always say, Russia is the country that lies on an industrial scale, and they weaponize lying. And I fear very much that that's what the part of what they're trying to do here.
Cormac Jerome, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll be calling on your expertise repeatedly in the forthcoming weeks. Thank you.